The silence was the thing she feared most. It came after the applause died down, after the studio lights went dark, after the last note faded into the rafters of an empty stadium. It was in the hollow quiet of a hotel suite built for a queen, but occupied by a ghost. For a woman whose entire existence was defined by sound, a voice that could move mountains and mend hearts. The silence was an accusation. It was a void where the love was supposed to be. And in the end, the silence won. But her story did not begin in silence. It began in the heart of the sound, in the pews of a New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey. It began with the gospel. It was a sound born of faith, a sound that rose from the congregation like a shared prayer. She was just a little girl then, watching her mother, Sissy Houston, a formidable gospel and soul singer in her own right. She watched her command the choir, her voice a force of nature, a conduit for something divine. The girl, Whitney, sat and listened. She absorbed it all, the rhythm, the power, the release. Music was not a choice in that family. It was the air they breathed, the language they spoke. Her cousins, Dion and Dee Dee Warwick, were stars. Her godmother was Aretha Franklin, the queen of soul herself. Royalty ran in her bloodline. But with that inheritance came a weight, a legacy to uphold, a standard of impossible perfection. Sissy did not just teach her daughter how to sing. She taught her how to perform, how to phrase, how to connect with a power greater than herself. The lessons were rigorous, demanding. Perfection was the only acceptable outcome. The voice had to be flawless, an instrument polished until it shone with divine light. The young girl learned. She practiced. She listened. The voice grew inside her, a seed nurtured by faith and discipline. It was a gift, everyone said so, a gift from God. But even then, a shadow lingered. The gift came with expectations. The sound came with the pressure of the coming silence. She was being prepared for a stage far bigger than a church pulpit, being molded for a destiny she could not yet comprehend. And the world was not yet ready for the sound it was about to hear. It was a sound that would change everything. As a teenager, the stage was her second home. She wasn't the star yet, not a headliner. She was in the background, singing backup for her mother, for Shaka Khan, for Lou Rawls. She was learning the craft from the inside out, watching the masters at work. She learned about the energy of a crowd, the delicate dance between a singer and their band, the lonely miles on the tour bus. She saw the applause, but she also saw the exhaustion that followed. It was an education in the realities of the business, a world of dazzling lights and deep shadows. During these years, she found an anchor. Her name was Robin Crawford. They met as teenagers working at a community center, two girls from Jersey with big dreams. Their bond was immediate, deep, and fiercely protective. Robin became her confidant, her protector, her closest friend. In a world that was already beginning to pull and shape Whitney into an image, Robin saw the person, the girl behind the growing legend. It was a friendship that would become a sanctuary, a safe harbor in the storm that was to come. Her mother, Sissy, was cautious. She knew the industry's hunger. She had seen what it did to talented souls, how it could build them up into gods only to feast on their downfall. She kept Whitney close, shielding her from the record executives and producers who were beginning to circle. They heard the whispers. They heard about the girl with the voice. A voice that wasn't just good, but anointed. The offers started coming in, but Sissy turned them down. It wasn't time. She wasn't ready. The instrument needed to mature. But you cannot hide a light like that forever. The moment was inevitable. It came on a night when she was performing with her mother at a club in New York City. In the audience was a man who understood sound, a man who built careers. His name was Clive Davis. He was the head of Arista Records, a kingmaker. As Whitney took the stage to sing a solo number, the greatest love of all, the noisy club fell quiet. A hush descended, and then the voice. It was pure. It was powerful. It was emotionally perfect. It was a sound that seemed to come from another place entirely. Clive Davis was frozen in his seat. He had seen Elvis. He had signed Janis Joplin. He knew talent. But this was different. This was, he would later say, a once-in-a-generation discovery. He knew, in that instant, that he was looking at the future of music. After the set, he found his way backstage. He spoke to her to Sissy. He made his intentions clear. He didn't want to change her. He wanted to present her to the world. He promised to guide her, to protect her. That night, a pact was made. A career was born. A life was forever altered. It was the beginning of everything. And in its own way, the beginning of the end. The machine began to work. Clive Davis was not just a record executive. He was an architect of superstars. He understood that with a talent this monumental, the presentation had to be flawless. This was not just about making records. It was about creating an icon. The mission was clear. Whitney Houston was to be America's princess. She had to be elegant, graceful, and, most importantly, accessible to everyone. She had to transcend genre and race. Pop radio, R&B radio, adult contemporary, they all had to claim her as their own. The image was carefully curated. The girl from Newark with the gospel fire was polished into a glamorous, sophisticated songstress. The interviews were managed, the photo shoot styled to perfection. She was presented as the girl next door, if the girl next door had the voice of an angel and the poise of royalty. She was safe. She was beautiful. She was non-threatening. For a black female artist in the 1980s, this crossover appeal was a tightrope walk. There were whispers from the black community that her music was too pop, that she was selling out, that she was being whitened for mass consumption. At the 1989 Soul Train Awards, she was famously booed. The rejection stung deeply. She was a church girl from Newark. That music was in her soul. To be told she wasn't black enough was a profound wound. It was the first crack in the perfect facade, a sign of the immense pressure she was under to be all things to all people. Inside, a conflict was brewing. There was Whitney the icon, the pristine product smiling from magazine covers. And then there was Nippy, the girl who loved to laugh, who could be goofy and down to earth, the girl her family and closest friends knew. The girl who found solace and a sense of normalcy with Robin Crawford. Their bond was a grounding force in the dizzying ascent to fame. Robin was a constant, a reminder of who she was before the world decided who she should be. But even that relationship was a source of pressure, a secret that had to be kept hidden in an era far less accepting. The world demanded a princess, and a princess's story had to be a fairy tale. There was no room for complexity, no room for a narrative that deviated from the script. So she played the part. She smiled for the cameras. She gave the perfect answers. And she sang. She poured all the conflict, all the confusion, all the unspoken feelings into the music. It was the one place she could be completely, authentically herself. The voice held all. The joy, the pain, the loneliness. And the world was about to listen. The debut album was not an overnight sensation. It was a slow, deliberate ignition. Clive Davis and his team worked the record with meticulous patience. They released You Give Good Love, a soulful, mid-tempo track that climbed the R&B charts and then crossed over to pop. It was the perfect introduction. Smooth, elegant, undeniable. Then came Saving All My Love for You. It was a ballad, a showcase for the sheer power and emotional depth of her voice. It went to #1. The world stopped and took notice. A star was not just rising. She was arriving, fully formed. The third single was How Will I Know? This was pure pop joy, an upbeat, infectious track with a vibrant, colorful music video. That video was a landmark moment. In an era when MTV was notoriously resistant to playing black artists, Whitney Houston shattered the barrier. Her beauty, her charisma, her undeniable star power were too bright to ignore. She wasn't just a voice on the radio anymore. She was a face, a personality, a presence. She became one of the first black women to receive heavy rotation on the channel, paving the way for countless artists who would follow. The hits kept coming. Greatest Love of All, the song that had mesmerized Clive Davis in that nightclub, became an anthem of self-love and empowerment, a global phenomenon. The album, Whitney Houston, went on to sell over 25 million copies worldwide. It became the best-selling debut album by a female artist in history. She was no longer just a promising singer. She was a superstar. The praise was universal. The critics lauded her technical perfection, her emotional range. She was compared to the greats. She was hailed as the voice of her generation. She won Grammys. She won American Music Awards. She was everywhere. Her face on every magazine, her voice on every radio station. She was living a dream, but the dream was all-consuming. The pressure intensified with every award, with every million records sold. The girl from a church choir was now the property of the world. She had to remain perfect. She had to keep smiling. The machine that had built her now demanded to be fed. More hits, more tours, more perfection. She was at the beginning of a climb to a height no one had ever seen before. And the higher you climb, the more isolated you become, and the further you have to fall. The applause was deafening, but she was already beginning to feel the silence that waited on the other side. The second album was a test. Could she do it again? Could she match the historic success of a debut? The world watched, waiting. The album was simply titled Whitney. It was a statement of confidence, and it delivered. It became the first album by a female artist to debut at #1 on the Billboard 200 chart. It was a feat that cemented her status as a pop music deity. The singles were unstoppable juggernauts. I Want to Dance with Somebody Who Loves Me was a blast of pure, unadulterated joy, a global anthem that filled dance floors from New York to Tokyo. Didn't We Almost Have It All was a soaring power ballad that showcased her dramatic vocal command. So emotional. Where Do Broken Hearts Go? For consecutive #1 hits from a single album, breaking a record held by the Beatles and the Bee Gees. She was not just a star. She was a phenomenon operating on a level of success that was almost unimaginable. The tours were massive, globe-spanning productions. She played to sold-out stadiums night after night. On stage, she was transcendent. Dressed in shimmering gowns, bathed in spotlights, she held tens of thousands of people in the palm of her hand. She was in complete control. The voice, a flawless and powerful instrument, never wavered. She gave the audience everything she had. She gave them perfection. But perfection takes its toll. The life of a global superstar is a life of profound contradictions. It is a life of roaring crowds and silent hotel rooms. A life surrounded by an entourage but steeped in a deep, gnawing loneliness. The demands were relentless. The schedule was brutal. Travel, interviews, photo shoots, rehearsals, performances. It was a machine, and she was its engine. She was a brand, a corporation, a symbol. The humanity, the vulnerability of a young woman from Newark was buried deeper and deeper beneath the weight of the icon. Friends and family saw the change. The easy laugh was a little harder to find. The light in her eyes sometimes seemed distant. The pressure to maintain the pristine image, the American princess persona, was a heavy crown to wear. She was a diamond being formed under immense pressure. But even diamonds can crack. She poured the loneliness into the songs. She poured the exhaustion into her performances. The stage became the only place where the pressure seemed to fade, replaced by the adoration of the crowd. Their love was a powerful drug, an affirmation that she was seen, that she was worthy. But the high was temporary. The applause always ended. And then came the silence. The quiet car ride back to the empty hotel. The loneliness creeping back in. She was on top of the world, but she had never felt more alone. The higher the fame, the deeper the isolation. And she was just getting started. There are moments in a nation's history that are crystallized by a song. Moments of trial and uncertainty, when a collective voice is needed to express a shared feeling. In January of 1991, America was a nation holding its breath. The Gulf War had just begun. The country was anxious, divided, and in need of reassurance. The stage was Super Bowl 25 in Tampa, Florida. It was the biggest television event of the year. And to sing the national anthem, they chose Whitney Houston. She walked onto the field, not in a glamorous gown, but in a simple white tracksuit. She looked like an everyday American. There was no pre-recorded track. She was singing live, accompanied by a full orchestra. And then she began. From a first note, it was clear this would be no ordinary rendition. It was something else entirely. She didn't just sing the words, she inhabited them. She transformed a familiar, often wrote song into a powerful, soul-stirring hymn. Her voice soared through the stadium, filled with a power and a passion that was almost overwhelming. She held the notes with breathtaking control, her gospel roots infusing the performance with a deep, spiritual resonance. In that moment, she wasn't just a pop star. She was the voice of a nation. For 2 minutes, everything else fell away. The politics, the fear, the division. There was only that voice, binding millions of people together in a shared moment of patriotism and hope. The reaction was immediate and unprecedented. The performance was so overwhelmingly popular that it was released as a single. It shot into the top 20 of the Billboard Hot 100, making her the only artist to have a national anthem become a pop hit. All proceeds were donated to charities supporting soldiers and their families. It was more than a performance. It was a cultural event. It cemented her place in the American pantheon. She was no longer just Whitney Houston, the singer. She was the voice. She was America's sweetheart, a unifying symbol of grace, talent, and patriotism. It was the absolute zenith of her public adoration. She had achieved a level of fame and respect that few artists ever know. She stood at the pinnacle, a flawless icon beloved by all. From this height, the view was incredible, but there was nowhere else to go but down. The pressure to live up to that moment, to that image of perfection, would become an impossible burden. She was a national treasure, but a treasure displayed in a glass case is not allowed to be human. It is not allowed to be flawed. And the perfect American princess was about to make a very human, very imperfect choice that would change her story forever. In the rarefied air of superstardom, genuine connection is a rare commodity. Everyone wants something from you. Every interaction is transactional. In this gilded cage, Whitney Houston longed for something real, something that wasn't polished and managed. She found it at the 1989 Soul Train Music Awards. The same night, she was booed by a portion of the crowd. She met Bobby Brown. On the surface, they were polar opposites. She was the pristine pop princess, the embodiment of elegance and grace. He was the bad boy of R&B, the swaggering, unapologetic frontman of New Edition who had cultivated an image of rebellion and raw street energy. Where she was smooth, he was rough. Where she was controlled, he was impulsive. And she was utterly captivated. To her inner circle, to her family, to Clive Davis, it made no sense. They saw danger. They saw a threat to the carefully constructed image that had made her a global phenomenon. They warned her. They pleaded with her. This was not part of the plan. But they didn't understand what she saw in him. She saw an escape. Bobby Brown was an antidote to the suffocating perfection of her life. He was not intimidated by her fame. He treated her not as Whitney Houston the icon, but as Whitney the woman. With him, she felt she could finally exhale. She could be Nippy from Newark, not the flawless queen on the pedestal. He represented a connection to the world she felt she had been forced to leave behind, a world that was messier, more authentic, more real. Their courtship was a whirlwind, played out under the intense glare of the media spotlight. The tabloids were obsessed. The good girl and the bad boy. It was a narrative too juicy to resist. Every date, every argument, every public appearance was scrutinized and dissected. The public was fascinated and horrified in equal measure. For Whitney, the criticism was just another cage. She felt the world wanted to control not only her music and her image, but her heart as well. And she rebelled. Her love for Bobby became an act of defiance. It was her choice, her life. She was asserting her independence from the machine that had created her. She loved him, and she would not let anyone tell her she was wrong. In 1992, they were married. The wedding was a lavish affair, a fairy tale for the cameras. She wore a gown of French lace and looked radiant. In that moment, she believed she was getting her happily ever after. She had found a love that felt real, a partner who saw behind the curtain. What she could not see was that she was not just marrying a man. She was marrying a lifestyle. She was inviting a storm into her carefully ordered world, a storm that would eventually tear everything apart. The world was watching her marriage with a mixture of fascination and concern, but her career was about to reach a new, stratospheric level. She had agreed to star in her first feature film, a romantic thriller called The Bodyguard, opposite Hollywood's biggest leading man, Kevin Costner. It was a risk. Many singers had tried and failed to make the leap to acting. But Whitney possessed a natural charisma, a vulnerability that translated beautifully to the screen. She played Rachel Marin, a music superstar haunted by a stalker, and the public saw a reflection of her own life in the role. The film was a massive box office success, becoming one of the highest-grossing films of the year. But it was the soundtrack that would etch her name into eternity. Clive Davis knew this was a pivotal moment. The soundtrack had to be monumental. Initially, the plan was for her to cover Jimmy Ruffin's What Becomes of the Brokenhearted. But when that song was used in another film, Kevin Costner suggested a different track, a heartfelt, country ballad written and recorded by Dolly Parton in the 1970s. The song was I Will Always Love You. In Whitney's hands, the song was completely reborn. She transformed it from a gentle, bittersweet farewell into a soul-shattering testament to the power of love. The arrangement started with her voice, unaccompanied, vulnerable, pure. Then it built, layer by layer, into a cataclysmic, earth-shaking crescendo. It was a vocal performance for the ages, a technical marvel that was also deeply, profoundly emotional. When it was released, it wasn't just a hit. It was a cultural event. The song spent a record-breaking 14 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It topped the charts in virtually every country on the planet. It became the best-selling single by a female artist in music history. The soundtrack album sold over 45 million copies worldwide, becoming the best-selling soundtrack of all time. She was no longer just the biggest pop star in the world. She was, for that moment, the most famous woman on earth. She won the Grammy for Album of the Year, Record of the Year, and Best Female Pop Vocal Performance. She was untouchable, an artist at the absolute peak of her powers and her fame. But the juxtaposition was brutal. As her public triumphs reached an impossible summit, her private life was beginning to unravel. The pressures of her marriage, combined with the suffocating weight of global superstardom, were creating a perfect storm. The woman who sang the greatest love song of all time was struggling to hold her own love story together. The soaring voice that filled the world with so much beauty was masking a growing pain, a darkness that was beginning to take hold. The higher the star, the darker the shadow it casts. By the mid-1990s, the pristine image of Whitney Houston was beginning to show cracks. The whispers that had once been confined to industry backrooms were now becoming tabloid headlines. Rumors of drug use, once unthinkable for America's sweetheart, were becoming persistent. Her behavior grew more erratic. She would show up late for interviews and photo shoots, or sometimes not at all. There were reports of canceled concerts and last-minute no-shows. The public, who had placed her on a pedestal of perfection, was confused and concerned. The most noticeable change was in her voice. The instrument that had once been a marvel of clarity and power began to sound strained, hoarse. The effortless high notes became a struggle. Her live performances, once a guarantee of vocal perfection, became unpredictable. Sometimes the magic was still there, a flash of the old brilliance. Other times, it was a painful shadow of its former glory. The world watched, holding its breath, hoping it was just a temporary issue, a product of exhaustion from her relentless schedule. Her marriage to Bobby Brown was a constant source of drama, a public spectacle that fueled the tabloid machine. They were the industry's most volatile couple. Their fights, their reconciliations, their legal troubles, it was all played out for public consumption. He was frequently painted as the villain, the corrupting influence who was dragging the princess down into the mud. The reality was likely far more complicated, a toxic codependency fueled by fame, pressure, and shared addictions. But the narrative was set. She was the victim, he was the cause. It was a simple story that absolved the public and the industry of any responsibility for the immense pressure they had placed upon her. She tried to fight back against the narrative. She continued to work, releasing the Waiting to Exhale soundtrack, which spawned another massive hit with Exhale, Shoop Shoop. She starred in more films, like The Preacher's Wife with Denzel Washington. She was trying to hold it all together to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. But the strain was visible. The light in her eyes, once so bright and full of promise, was often replaced by a look of weariness, of sadness. The joy seemed to have been leached out of her, replaced by a defensive posture against a world she felt was constantly judging her. The princess was trapped in a tower, and the tower was crumbling. The silence she had always feared was no longer just in the quiet moments. It was creeping into her music, into her voice, threatening to swallow her whole. The fall was no longer a distant possibility. It was happening in slow motion, right before the world's eyes. There was a moment of hope, a flash of the old brilliance that made the world believe a comeback was not only possible, but imminent. In 1998, she released My Love Is Your Love, her first studio album in 8 years. It was a departure from her polished pop past. The album was grittier, infused with hip-hop and R&B, featuring collaborations with a new generation of artists like Wyclef Jean, Missy Elliott, and Lauryn Hill. It was a statement. She was reclaiming her roots, shedding the princess gown for something more authentic, more real. The album was a critical and commercial success. The title track was a reggae-infused ode to enduring love. It's Not Right, But It's Okay was a fierce anthem of female empowerment that became a dance club staple. It seemed like she had found her footing again. She won another Grammy. She was back, but it was a fragile piece. The underlying demons had not been vanquished. They had only been temporarily quieted. The true state of her life was laid bare for the world to see in a 2002 interview with Diane Sawyer. It was intended to be an opportunity to clear the air, to dispel the rumors and reclaim her narrative. Instead, it became one of the most infamous and heartbreaking moments in television history. She appeared frail, gaunt, and defiant. When Sawyer pressed her about the drug allegations, Whitney uttered the line that would haunt her forever. She denied using crack cocaine, famously stating, "Crack is cheap. I make too much money to ever smoke crack. Crack is whack." It was a moment of raw, unvarnished, and disastrous honesty. Her attempt at defiance was interpreted as a bizarre, non-denial denial. It confirmed the public's worst fears. The mystique was shattered. The elegant icon was replaced by a troubled woman in the throes of a devastating addiction. The interview was a point of no return. The narrative shifted irrevocably. The public conversation was no longer dominated by her incredible talent, but by her tragic downfall. She became a punchline on late-night talk shows, a cautionary tale whispered in tabloids. The empathy and concern that had once surrounded her curdled into pity, ridicule, and morbid curiosity. The machine that had built her up so high was now reveling in her demolition. The fall was no longer a slow descent. It was a free fall. She had spent her life running from the silence, filling every space with her powerful voice. But now, her voice was being drowned out by the noise of public judgment. She was losing control of her story, of her life, of herself. The years that followed were a descent into a wilderness of her own making, broadcast for the world to see. The illusion of control was gone, replaced by a raw and painful reality. In 2005, she and Bobby Brown agreed to participate in a reality television show, Being Bobby Brown. It was a catastrophic decision. The show was an unfiltered, often disturbing look into their chaotic life. The cameras captured a Whitney Houston the world had never seen and never wanted to see. She was no longer the polished, regal superstar. She was erratic, often incoherent, living in a household that seemed to be in a constant state of disarray. The mystique that had been so carefully crafted over decades was obliterated in a matter of episodes. The woman who had sung the national anthem with such grace and dignity was now a character in a tragic reality show, her pain packaged as entertainment. The voice, her divine gift, suffered the most. It became a casualty of her lifestyle. The once pristine instrument was now ravaged, a shadow of its former self. Concerts became painful spectacles. A world tour in 2004 was plagued by cancellations and disastrous performances. She struggled to hit the notes that had once come so effortlessly. Her voice was raspy, weak. The audience, who came hoping to witness a resurrection, instead became witnesses to a slow, public decline. They saw not a diva, but a woman in deep pain, a legend lost in the woods. The headlines were brutal. Whitney's crack up, the tragic fall of a superstar. She was hounded by paparazzi, her every misstep documented and sold to the highest bidder. The world that had once adored her now seemed to be morbidly watching her, waiting for the inevitable end. She became a symbol of wasted talent, a walking tragedy. The loneliness that had always haunted her in the quiet moments now seemed to be her constant companion, even in the glare of the cameras. She was profoundly lost. The girl from Newark, the church choir prodigy, the American princess, the global icon. All those versions of herself seemed to have disappeared, leaving behind a fragile, broken woman trying to navigate the wreckage of her life. The applause had long since faded. The silence was deafening, and in that silence, the demons grew louder. She was in the darkest part of the valley, and it was unclear if she would ever find the strength to climb out. After years in the wilderness, a glimmer of light appeared on the horizon. In 2007, she took the first, crucial step toward reclaiming her life. She divorced Bobby Brown. The separation was the end of a tumultuous 14-year chapter that had been defined by addiction, drama, and heartbreak. With that storm behind her, there was a sense of hope, a belief that she could finally begin to heal. She retreated from the public eye, focusing on her health and her relationship with her daughter, Bobby Christina. And she went back to the one place that had always been her sanctuary: the music. Clive Davis, the man who had discovered her all those years ago, was still there. He had never lost faith in her. He believed that the voice, though damaged, could be coaxed back. He rallied the industry's best songwriters and producers. The project was approached with a sense of purpose and care. This was not just another album. It was a resurrection. The result was the 2009 album, I Look to You. The title itself was a prayer, a declaration of faith in a higher power and in her own ability to overcome. The music was a mix of triumphant ballads and contemporary R&B, a sound that was both classic Whitney and modern. The lead single, $1 Million Bill, was an upbeat, feel-good track that had fans dancing again. The title track was a soaring, inspirational ballad that showcased the raw emotion that remained in her voice. It was not the voice of the 1980s. The crystalline purity was gone, replaced by a huskier, more weathered tone. But the soul was still there. The pain, the struggle, and the hope, it was all audible in her delivery. The world wanted to believe. The public, who had watched her fall with a mixture of horror and fascination, now rooted for her with a fierce, protective love. They wanted the comeback story. They needed to see their fallen queen rise again. Her promotional appearances were met with an outpouring of support. She sat down with Oprah Winfrey for a candid, two-part interview, confessing the depths of her addiction and her journey toward recovery. She was honest, vulnerable, and repentant. It felt like a cleansing. The album debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200 chart. It was a commercial triumph. It seemed the redemption narrative was complete. Whitney was back. The darkness was behind her. She had looked into the abyss and had found her way back to the light. It was the story everyone wanted to hear. It was the story she desperately wanted to live. But the ghosts of the past are not so easily exorcised. The success of the I Look to You album created enormous expectations. A comeback isn't complete until it's proven on stage. A world tour was announced, the Nothing But Love World Tour. It was meant to be her triumphant return, a chance for her to reconnect with the fans who had stood by her and to prove to the world and to herself that she was truly back. The tour began in Russia in late 2009. From the very first shows, it was clear something was wrong. The voice was not ready. It was unpredictable, fragile. On good nights, she could summon flashes of her former brilliance, moments that reminded the audience of the legend she was. But on bad nights, it was a catastrophe. She struggled to get through songs, her voice cracking, giving out completely. She would stop mid-performance, looking breathless and defeated. She would rely on her backup singers to carry the melodies, a heartbreaking sight for anyone who remembered her once effortless command. The reviews were devastating. The headlines were cruel. Whitney's tour in tatters. Fans walk out on Houston. Videos of her struggling on stage went viral, each one a painful document of her decline. The audience reaction was a mixture of disappointment, anger, and deep, profound sadness. They had come to celebrate her return, but instead, they found themselves bearing witness to her struggle. For Whitney, it must have been a living nightmare. The stage, once her sanctuary, had become a place of judgment and failure. The very instrument that had been her gift from God, the source of her identity and her fame, had betrayed her. She was a warrior without her sword. Each night was a gamble, a battle against her own body, a fight she was losing in front of thousands of people. The tour limped on, through Europe and Australia, plagued by cancellations and postponements due to illness. The official explanation was respiratory infections, but the world suspected the truth was far more complicated and tragic. The pressure of the comeback, the physical toll of touring, the constant public scrutiny, it was all too much. The hope that had surrounded the album's release began to evaporate, replaced by a familiar sense of dread. The comeback was faltering. The redemption story was falling apart. She was running on fumes, a ghost of her former self, haunted by the memory of the voice she once had. The tour was supposed to be a celebration of love and resilience. Instead, it became a final, grueling testament to her pain. The silence was no longer just a fear. It was a physical reality, a gaping hole where the music used to be. The final chapter was quiet. After the disastrous world tour, she retreated again, living a life largely out of the spotlight, save for the occasional paparazzi photo that would spark another round of worried headlines. She was working on another film, a remake of Sparkle, playing the mother of a talented young singer who succumbs to the pressures of fame and addiction. The irony was not lost on anyone. It was a role that mirrored her own life and the life of so many others she had known. She seemed to be in a better place. She spoke of her faith, of her love for her daughter. There was a fragile sense of peace. In February of 2012, she traveled to Los Angeles for Grammy Week. It was her homecoming. The Grammy Awards were the stage of her greatest triumphs. She was scheduled to attend the annual pre-Grammy Gala hosted by her mentor and lifelong champion, Clive Davis. It was a celebration she had graced as a queen for decades. On the afternoon of Saturday, February 11th, the day of the party, Whitney Houston was found unresponsive in the bathtub of her suite at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. Paramedics were called. They worked to revive her, but it was too late. At 3:55 p.m., she was pronounced dead. She was 48 years old. The news spread like a shockwave around the world. It was unthinkable, yet somehow horribly inevitable. The world stopped. Downstairs in the very same hotel, Clive Davis's party was about to begin. The red carpet was rolled out. The stars were arriving. The news began to filter through the crowd, hushed whispers of disbelief turning into a wave of sorrow. The party became an impromptu wake, a somber, surreal gathering of friends and colleagues trying to process the incomprehensible loss of the woman who was supposed to be there celebrating with them. The Grammy Awards ceremony the next night was transformed into a tribute. A sense of profound grief hung over the entire music industry. Host LL Cool J opened the show with a prayer. Jennifer Hudson, a singer who, like so many, had been inspired by Whitney, performed a tearful, powerful rendition of I Will Always Love You. The performance was heartbreaking, a passing of the torch that no one had ever wanted to see. The voice of a generation was gone. The silence she had fought against her entire life had finally, irrevocably, claimed her. The story, it seemed, had ended in the deepest, most absolute tragedy. In the days and weeks after her death, something remarkable happened. The noise of the tabloids, the judgment, the ridicule, it all fell away. It was replaced by the sound she had created. Her music surged back to the top of the charts around the world. Radio stations played her songs on a continuous loop. People shared their memories of where they were when they first heard, "I Want to Dance with Somebody," or how greatest love of all had gotten them through a difficult time. The world was not remembering the tragic figure from the reality shows or the struggling performer on that final tour. They were remembering the voice. They were remembering the joy, the power, and the transcendent beauty she had brought into their lives. Her story began to be reevaluated. It was no longer seen as a simple cautionary tale of addiction. It was understood as a far more complex story about the crushing weight of fame, the impossible pressure of perfection, and the loneliness that can exist at the very peak of success. She was seen not as a fallen idol, but as a profoundly human woman who was given a divine, once-in-a-lifetime gift and who struggled with the immense burden that came with it. She was the church girl from Newark who became a global queen, a black woman who broke down racial barriers in popular music, a symbol of elegance and power who privately battled fierce demons. Her triumphs were historic. Her struggles were heartbreaking. Her legacy is not the tragedy of her death, but the eternal life of her music. The voice lives on. It echoes in the countless singers she inspired. It rings out at weddings, at proms, at karaoke bars. It is the soundtrack to millions of lives, a permanent part of our cultural fabric. In death, she was finally freed. Freed from the pressure, from the judgment, from the pain. Freed from the image she could never live up to and the demons she could not escape. The silence that haunted her in life can no longer touch her. Because when you have a voice like that, a voice that powerful, that pure, that full of love, it never truly goes silent. It becomes a part of the world's song. It plays on forever. And maybe that is what makes her unforgettable. The voice found a peace that the woman never could. And we will always love her for it.